chapter, verses 13 through 15. In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" But they did not know what it was. But Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. All right, are y'all ready for this? I mean, the story continues. I can hardly stand the excitement. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. All right. This morning we are continuing our sermon series, Who is God? And in case you missed a couple of episodes, a few weeks ago we saw the great tenderness of God in the garden as God created Adam and Eve and gave them the capacity to love and be loved, but also gave them the free will to choose not to love. And they took that free will and chose not to love God. And we see God with a broken heart, but God who is unwilling, even in heartache, to abandon humanity. Now, last week, we see a different dimension of God. Last week, you remember, we see God the warrior, God who raised his mighty right arm and fought the power of political empire to bust his slaves loose and lead them through water to a new country, a new future, freedom, and wholeness. Now, this week, we get to check in on that community of new believers, that first community of God, that ragtag assortment of lawbreakers and runaway slaves and immigrants. And they busted out of their chains. They are living in freedom for the first time. They're camping in what is probably a beautiful desert. And we expect them to be happy, do we not? But we look in on them this Sunday morning, and they are not happy. You heard what they are saying through Terry's reading. They're not really happy and they're not really whole yet, this new community of believers, because they are still learning who God is and they're still learning who they are. And they've lived 400 years, think about that, without any kind of freedom. So we see God working on them and God working with them, and it is, I ask you all to consider this as we contemplate who is God. I ask you to look at the wisdom and the compassion of God in that moment, in that reality, to understand that it's one thing to set someone free, and it's quite another thing for them to be ready to live in freedom. This new community of God's people are having a severe case of buyer's remorse. They are not happy, are they, about the choice they have made. These people have been busted out of slavery and busted out of their chains, and what they say is, "Oh man, I wish we were back in Egypt. I wish we were back there. At least then we had bread. We could eat bread and we could smell the tasty meat of the Egyptians cooking. How I wish I could just go back to my old ways. This is hard and this is scary. How I wish I could just kind of slink back into the chains of slavery." And you go, what? Right? I mean, we just go, what? How could anybody feel that way? And it's easy for us to be really judgmental about the Israelites in this moment. But I think that's a mistake, because what we have to remember is that these people are scared. And these people are starving, and they have no idea what the next day might look like. They have no idea where their next meal is going to come from. And so they cry out in the desert, and they look fondly back to when life made a little bit more sense, even though it was not a good life. But still, we can try to be understanding, right? But it sounds a little ungrateful, does it not? This reaction of the Israelites. And we wonder, the God who just showed up was the tough and strong warrior God. You kind of wonder how this God is going to respond to what sounds to us like some whiny complaining, right? I would not be surprised for God to say, "That sounds so good to you? Well, have at it, Bubba. Walk on back. Get right back in those chains. See how they fit you." We wouldn't be surprised, would we, to see God say, "Freedom isn't free, and it's not easy. Buck up and shut up. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Dig in." I think that would be an entirely reasonable response of God's. But God, in this moment, reveals something to those people and to us, a revelation of God's character and God's nature. These people had lived under the thumb of empire, had toiled and suffered for a few dry crumbs of Pharaoh's bread, and now here they are in a desert. The Bible calls it a wilderness, but wilderness, literally translated in ancient Hebrew, is desert. That's a whole different feel, right? This is kind of an aside. But if you think wilderness, you think about what lies on the other side of the Bitterroot Mountains over there, you think, well, there's food there. There are elk, and there are berries, and there are mushrooms, and I can make a living there. I could find a way to eat there. That's not what the Israelites were in. The Israelites were in a desert. That's a whole different deal, right? They were surrounded as far as they could see by nothing but grains of sand. And so these people for whom food has always been a worry, has always been an issue, these people are there where there's no food. There's no food anywhere as far as they can see. And they say, what kind of God brings us to here to starve to death? And God hears through what sounds for all the world to us like ungratefulness and complaining. And God hears into their hearts the fear and the anxiety and the uncertainty. This God of great compassion in the middle of the desert where there is no food at all suddenly showers them with the best things that the grocery store of creation has to offer. This camp of starving people all of a sudden is surrounded by this mysterious bread. Manna. Manna literally means, in Hebrew, what is it? That's what it means. What is it? Now, some traditions, including the one in Exodus, say that manna tasted like wafers made of honey. And then another tradition, I think it's in the book of Numbers, says, no. It tasted like sweet cakes cooked in olive oil. And interpreters, seeing this discrepancy for many years back, have said, really what manna tasted like was your favorite kind of bread. And I kind of like that, because I will tell you this: there is no Southerner alive in the world who has any doubt but what manna is Grandma's homemade biscuits made with lard and buttermilk. That's the finest bread in the world, as sure as I'm standing here this morning. It's an interesting thing, right? If that thing which God sent to them tasted like their favorite bread, what does your favorite bread taste like? I wonder if it tastes like the burnt toast that your 4-year-old daughter or son brought to you one Saturday morning because they woke up and decided you deserve breakfast in bed. I wonder if it tastes like the sourdough rolls that your mama made for nobody but you every time you came home. Or maybe it tastes like the stale and steamed hot dog bun you got from the concession stand that time you watched your child's team play for a state title. A bread like that, a bread that tastes like comfort and memory for those who have it, those who are lucky enough to have memories and comfort, is amazing. And a bread for those who do not have that, a bread that tastes like hope and dreams for a new future, that's an impressive bread. That's really something. But manna is only one half of the food miracle that God performed out in the desert. And I'm going to make a bold theological claim this morning. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for a redneck from Georgia to make a bold theological anything. But I'm telling you, I think that is not the biggest part of the miracle. We talk a lot about manna. I don't think that's the biggest part of the miracle. Now, most Sundays, or most weeks before Sunday, when I'm preparing for a sermon, I do all the studying and I think, there's not one thing I can say that has not been said. There's not one thing I can add to a conversation about God that has been going on for 2,000 years in our faith and 3,500 years in Judaism. But this week, something happened. This week, as I was preparing for this sermon, I consulted the study Bibles, and I looked at the scholarly commentaries on the book of Exodus. I looked at all the resources that a preacher studies to get educated and ready for a sermon, and I discovered a horrifying gap in the biblical knowledge of this event. All those books, all those resources, when they describe quail, you know how they describe it? I want you guys to put on your seatbelts and hold on to something for this, because it's shocking. I was stunned. All of these learned treatises, these scholarly commentaries, these carefully interpreted study Bibles, on all the footnotes, when they describe quail, they describe them as, quote, a bird. A bird. I mean, guys, I got to tell you, that's like saying Mount Everest is a hill. That's like saying a flathead cherry is a small red thing. It's like saying that first morel mushroom of the season, that perfect spring morel, is a fungus. I got to tell you, a quail is not merely a bird. When God gave quail to those scared and starving children in the desert, He was giving them so much more than just a bird. I will go so far this morning as to say that we can't answer the question, who is God, without examining the question, what are quail? That's another bold theological claim. That's number 2. Write it down. Wild quail, for anyone who has eaten them or anyone who has hunted for them, anyone who's done that knows that they are an amazing and near perfect creature in creation. Let me give you an idea of what people today do in order to have a few wild quail in their lives or in their frying pan. A 2-day hunt for you and a few of your buddies on a quail plantation that has wild birds will set you back about $25,000. That's something? Now, there are some people who can't stop there. And they've got to have a viable quail population on their land. And today, as crazy as it sounds, there are any number of people in the South and of the Eastern Seaboard who will spend $500,000 every year just to have a dozen or a few dozen coveys of wild quail for their buddies and them to hunt for a few months out of the year. And if that's not crazy enough, and it ought to be, if you want to start from scratch and have your own quail plantation, you can do that. There are properties on the market today where you can buy a quail plantation with the house and the horses and the buggies and the dogs and the kennels and all that. And they are between $25 and $35 million. For what? For quail. What is quail? A bird. A bird. I don't think so. I want to tell you all about a man named Quail of Valdine. Now, for years, I thought his name was Guy, because it's G-U-Y, right? But he's French, so it's Guy de la Valdine. Guy de la Valdine was born a member of French royalty, and he grew up in a magnificent castle in a beautiful rural part of the rolling French countryside. Guy de la Valdine has spent a lifetime traveling to the world's most beautiful places, chasing the world's most demanding species. He's fished for trout in Montana and hunted for birds in Montana. Now, Guy de la Valdine, this member of French royalty, could live anywhere he wants, could do anything he wants. Let me tell you where he lives. Guy de la Valdine lives in North Florida, far from any beach or beautiful ocean. He lives just below the border of southwest Georgia. I know this country well, and it has been charitably, in my view, described as the armpit of the American South. It is flat, it is hot, it is ugly. In the spring, the bugs are so thick that you can't take a deep breath without gagging on them. But Guy de la Valdine has chosen to live there. And he has spent a fortune on a smallish piece of land, loving it, tending it, eradicating the invasive species, and planting all manner of specialized crops to feed a small wild bird who happens to live on that land. What in the world would possess a member of French royalty to spend his inheritance, just dump it down this red clay money pit? Quail! Quail! There are wild quail on that place. And Guy has given his life to improving the habitat and enhancing the numbers of wild quail on his farm. For what? A bird. As Guy says, for a handful of feathers. And that's the name he gave his book about that experience. Now, man is not the only predator who's a little bit gaga over wild quail. From coyotes to red-tailed hawks, from wild hogs to bald eagles, quail are the hot fudge sundae of the predator world, straight up. As Guy de la Valdine says, every predator in the world would love to eat a quail. Every predator. And those that are shrewd enough and fast enough will chase that plump, tasty, fat little bird from now until the end of time. If you ever see a chef on one of those like fancy chef shows, laboring for hours, lavishing some small something with the most expensive ingredients in the world, chances are he or she is working on a quail, which is really sort of a waste because all a quail needs is a little bit of campfire heat and smoke. Here's my question this morning. Well, before I get to that. I don't know what the nastiest bird is in creation. What is the worst tasting bird in the world? I mean, maybe a pelican? Or a buzzard? Crow? A crow cannot taste good. There's no way a crow tastes good, right? But if you were starving in the desert, you'd be glad to have even a crow, right? So here's my question. When the new community of God cried out in hunger in the desert for food, they would have been glad to have anything. They would have been glad to have anything. They would have eaten anything. What does it say? What does it say about our God that He sent them quail? What does it say about our God to these people who would have been happy with anything? That God sent them the very best. These runaway slaves who had spent their life in chains, suffering for a few dry crumbs of Pharaoh's bread, smelling the meat that the Egyptians cooked, but never getting to eat any of it themselves. Quail hunting is known as the sport of kings. But these runaway slaves, these immigrants, these lawbreakers, this new community of God who had turned away from the king, were given more wild quail than any king in the world has ever seen. It rained down on their camp by the thousands, piled up like snow. And these former slaves, who would never have dreamed of being able to have the king's food, of being able to have a wild quail, were suddenly grilling them over a campfire every single night. God said to them, and God says to us, said to that community of believers, says to this community of believers, follow me. Follow me into a future of wholeness and freedom. Leave behind the chains of whatever yesterday enslaved you with. The amazing part to me, and the part I think that really reveals God's character, is this: that in our worst, least admirable, most human moment of whining and complaining and saying, I want to go back. I want to go back to what I used to do. I want to turn back to my wicked ways because this future is scary. When we say, just let me crawl back into the chains that held me, God does not abandon us. But at that moment, incredibly, God draws near to us and says, child, you are not starving. You are in no danger. A banquet has been laid for you in a place where food is unimaginable. Even now, the tables groan under the weight of food that only a king could have. Even now, the platters are piled high with a bread that says to you, comfort and love, or dream and hope. At our worst human moment, God says to us, you need not fear. You need only open your eyes, come to the table, and dig in. Amen.